Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha. Welcome back, young friends and everyone joining for this gradual teaching series. We are now looking at the Buddha's gradual instructions on sensual pleasures, and more specifically the danger in sensual pleasures. So as you know, if you've been following along, we've looked at the talk on giving, the talk on virtue, and most recently the talk on heavenly realms. And of course, we've had a number of talks looking at different things under these particular modules. Now, what's important to understand as we get to this midway point is that all these things are linked, and we are gradually and sequentially building up based on the Buddha's teachings. As we listen to this talk on the danger in sensual pleasures, it's good to know that it's also linked to the previous talks. And so we're developing more wisdom, and the Buddha is correcting our view about certain things. So one of the things to bear in mind is that as we go through sensual pleasures, we think that we have the right view about sensual pleasures. We think we can overcome certain things, even though someone might come and tell us there's danger. And that's our ignorance or our conceit. And so one of the really important things about listening to a talk on sensual pleasures is that you bear in mind that Buddha is someone, if you have some conviction towards him and his enlightenment and what he has seen, and also if you've had any good meditations based on the Buddha's teaching, based on this Dhamma, then that's what you lean on when you listen to this talk. Because many people, even at the time of the Buddha, some of his monks, they had this pernicious or very silly view that would say, even though the Buddha would give this teaching that there are obstructions, and if you engage in certain obstructions, it will block the path. It will block your development of wisdom on this path. And one of the examples was sensual pleasures. So when you listen to this talk, listen to the Buddha's words and those of the Noble Arahants, and bear in mind that if you have any confidence in the Buddha's teaching, based on what we've gone through so far, or the fruits of the meditation that you have, this is what you lean on as you listen to this difficult subject, because it is difficult. When we experience difficult situations, we always turn to sensual pleasures. It's our go-to, and you'll understand what I mean when we go through the material of this talk. So that's the main thing to bear in mind. And the second thing is always, if one wants to be suvacha, easy to instruct, which is a loving kindness metta quality, then one needs to follow the instructions and also have a very open mind. And then after this talk, you go away and you contemplate it. And we will have a meditation later on that will help us to understand sensual pleasures a little better. So let's begin. What we'll cover in this session is a number of things. We'll begin with the Pali words that the Buddha uses, and we'll explain what they mean. So we get an understanding about where the Buddha is coming from. Then we'll look at how should sensual pleasures be understood, like what does the Buddha say? Then after that, we'll look at the different kinds of sensual pleasures. We'll look at the dangers of sensual pleasures. We'll go through some very, very useful similes for sensual pleasures and explain them a little bit. And then we'll look at some of the skillful things we can do. Let's begin by looking at the Pali words that the Buddha usually uses in terms of describing these sensual pleasures. So he says, kāmānaṁ, ādīnavaṁ, okāraṁ, saṅkilesaṁ. So that literally translates as the danger, degradation, and defilement in sensual pleasures. So kāma is the Pali word for sensual pleasures, and usually it means things that we enjoy through our five senses. So ear, eyes, nose, tongue, body. And these are the things that we enjoy, we take pleasure in, things that we find agreeable, and therefore expect the happiness to come from them. Now, the three key words that the Buddha uses is ādīnavaṁ. Now this means danger, but it can also mean disadvantage, drawbacks, peril, even misery. They're the things that Buddha says or uses this word because it keeps us bound to dukkha. And we'll see why when we go through the things in this session. The second word that the Buddha uses is okāraṁ. So the word that we mentioned before is degradation, but it can also just mean decline, deterioration. It can even mean lowliness. And I think really what we're looking at here is that Buddha is saying a lot of these things, they're worthless. Now at this stage, at the beginning of the talk, we can't understand that because we think, oh, but yeah, all these things that we enjoy, they're great. But Buddha is saying actually, when you really dig into it, you really examine it, even your experience of it, he says it's always declining, it's always decaying, and at the end of the day, it deteriorates. And so that's why you need to be cautious of it. And then the third word is saṅkilesaṁ, which means impurity, defilement, because kilesa we know is defilement or corruption. And the way that one can look at it is, it means that it usually breeds defilements. And this will become much more clear as we go through. So that's basically what this talk is about. It's good for us to look at this story of a Brahmin. It appears in a couple of places in the suttas. The first is in the Dhammapada with a verse of the Buddha, but also in the Sutta Nipata there's a sutta called Karma Sutta, which we'll be going through. And so this story of the Brahmin's interesting because he's a farmer and he's ploughing a field near where Buddha is staying, which is Jetavana Monastery in Savatthi. And the Buddha is going for alms round with a sangha of bhikkhus, and he comes across this Brahmin and looks at him. And he realizes that this Brahmin is about to lose all his crops. And he also realizes that he has the supporting conditions to become a stream enterer, which is very, very important. So then he also contemplates and he realizes that now is not the right time to give this particular Brahmin farmer a teaching. And the right time would actually be after he loses his crops and when he is experiencing sorrow. That's the opportunity for him to hear the Dhamma and to enter the stream. And so instead of giving him a teaching, he goes up to the Brahmin and decides to be cordial or friendly with him. And so he says to the Brahmin, "How are you, Brahmin?" And the Brahmin replies, "Oh, Gautama the ascetic has come to be friendly with me." And he's very pleased. And so he tells the Buddha that he is planting his field with barley in order to get a good crop. So time passes and they are friendly with each other. And when the crops were thriving, so after some time, the Buddha also comes back into Savatthi after finishing his meal. And he goes up to the Brahmin and he says, "Your barley field is looking good, Brahmin." And the Brahmin says to him, "Yes, the barley field looks very good. And when it flourishes, I will share a portion with you." This is what the Brahmin farmer says to the Buddha. Then after 4 months had passed, the barley was ripe for harvesting. And the Brahmin thought, "I'll cut it down, maybe today, maybe tomorrow." And so that's what his thinking was. But then a great rain cloud gathered, and all night it flooded the field. The Brahmin was very distressed throughout the night, thinking, "Oh, what will happen to my field? Why is there so much rain?" Then in the morning he went to the bank of the river and he saw that his entire crop was destroyed. And so he was very, very upset, went into deep sorrow and thought, "I'm ruined. How will I live?" And when the night was coming to an end, the Blessed One saw using his Buddha eye, he knew that the time had come to go and give the Brahmin a teaching. So he again entered Savatthi on alms round, and he stood by the door of the Brahmin's house. And when the Brahmin saw the Blessed One, he thought, "Ascetic Gautama has come to console me in my sorrow." So he prepared a seat and took the Blessed One's bowl and invited him to sit down. And then the Buddha said to him, "Brahmin, are you in a bad mood? Are you okay?" And the Brahmin said to the Buddha, "Yes, Master Gautama, my entire barley field was flooded." And then the Blessed One said, "One should not become sad or dejected at a time of loss or jubilant at a time of success." And then he said, "Sensual pleasures sometimes succeed and sometimes fail." And then, having known what was a suitable teaching for the Brahmin, he went on and gave him a Dhamma teaching. So in the Dhammapada verse, the Buddha actually says this particular saying. He says, "When there's craving, sorrow arises. From craving, fear arises. One who is free from craving, with sorrow not present, where then is the fear?" And so this is the thing that we're going to look at in this particular session around sensual pleasures. With the Brahmin farmer's story in mind, it can help us to understand this teaching of the Buddha in the Karma Sutta. So let's go verse by verse. The first verse, the Buddha says, when a mortal desires sensual pleasures, if that succeeds for him, surely he is elated in mind, having gained what he desires. So in the case of the Brahmin farmer, he's worked very, very hard, and his intention was to be able to have a very, very good bumper crop of barley. Now the night before, he was thinking, oh, the crop is looking very, very good, and he's expecting success. At that time, he is thinking, I'm going to gain that. And so his mind is very, very buoyant and very, very jubilant, as the Buddha would say. But then when we go to the next verse, the Buddha says, but when full of sensual desire, a person is aroused by desire, if those sensual pleasures decline, he is afflicted as if pierced by a dart. So again, you understand here that he was fearful when the rain was falling. So that's what happens when you're very attached, when you crave and expect for something to happen. In his case, he wanted to be able to harvest his bumper crop of barley. And when it rained and it kept raining, he got very fearful, thinking, oh no, what's going to happen? Will I keep my crop? Will it be totally destroyed? So all night he was worried about it and fearful. And then the next day what happened was he found that the floods had destroyed his entire crop of barley. And so that's when the dart pierces you. You then become very, very sad, upset, and then sorrowful. So he lost his sensual pleasures due to flood. So that's the second paragraph. The third paragraph, the Buddha says, one who avoids sensual pleasures like a serpent's head with the foot, being mindful overcomes this attachment to the world. So the Buddha is saying here, just like you would avoid a snake, you would steer clear of it, make sure you didn't go too near it. That's how, if you avoid sensual pleasures with mindfulness, then you would overcome the craving towards it, the desire for it, the intense desire for it. Because you know that danger comes, it can be taken away, is what the Buddha is saying. Just like this Brahmin farmer and his crop. So then the Buddha goes on to describe what are sensual pleasures. He says, fields, land, bullion, cattle and horses, slaves and servants, women, relatives. And then the Buddha says, when a person greedily longs for various sensual pleasures, even the weak overpower him, obstacles crush him, then suffering enters him as water does a broken boat. So when you hear that description from the Buddha sees attachment or desire for sensual pleasures as a weakness. He sees it as something that will crush you. So you look at the Brahmin farmer before the Buddha came to console him and give him a teaching. He was weighed down with the loss. He was weighed down with all that hard work, and it was all for nothing. And so it was crushing him with sorrow, sadness, depression. So when the Buddha says it's like water coming into a broken boat, you can't stop it. It's just filling up, and you do everything you can, but it's overwhelming you. And so then the final paragraph is, therefore, ever mindful, a person should avoid sensual pleasures. Having abandoned them, one can cross the flood, as by bailing out of the boat, one can reach the far shore. So the Buddha is talking about this in both a everyday mundane sense, but also in a greater sense. So in a mundane sense, he's actually saying be very cautious about one's expectations or desires towards sensual things that we experience through our sense faculties. And in an ultimate sense, based on his full teaching, he's saying abandon all of them, because otherwise you can't experience the supreme happiness. You'll only have these fleeting moments, and then you'll also experience a lot of displeasure, a lot of dejection, and a lot of sorrow when they come to an end. So there's a lot here that one can really contemplate. It's a very, very important teaching. And using the farmer, the Brahmin farmer as the example, you can really see where the Buddha's pointing to. Sensual pleasures don't last. Something happens to them. And then we go from the buoyancy of jubilation, joy, and happiness all the way down to the depths of sorrow, unhappiness, depression even. In order to connect this with sensual pleasures, because most of the time we have similar examples to the Brahman farmer, the story of the Brahman farmer, but we don't recognize them as being danger in sensual pleasures. And so I'll give a few examples. Some of them will be related to the younger youth audience, and some I'll also say are related to people who are older. So for example, you might want something from the shop. You've been looking forward to get something that's new, maybe some piece of new technology or a book that you've really wanted to read. You go to the shop really happy, thinking that you're going to get it. Then you get there and you realize it's sold out. Or another example is you're looking forward to a concert and it's your favorite singer, and you hear news that after booking tickets and you've booked the hotel and travel arrangements, you find out that the singer has postponed and then later on cancelled the whole thing, and you spent all this money, or your parents have spent all this money, and you think, am I going to get the money back? What am I going to do? And you get kind of upset, angry, and then disappointed. Or you have a pet, and this pet has been with you for a very long time, and it gets sick, and then it passes away. Or it's your parents, they sit you down one day, and everything's been fine, and then you hear from them that they're getting a divorce. And so these are things that we can't quite understand. But when they happen, it's exactly like the story of the Brahman farmer. One minute, you're overjoyed, full of expectation, or thinking everything is safe and secure, and the next minute, the rug has been pulled out from under us. And when it relates to being older, it could be a job. Things are going well, you've been promoted a few times, you have a good salary, or you run your own business and everything is good. But in the case of being employed, one day you come into work and your boss calls you in and says, I'm sorry, I have to lay you off. And so you lose your job. And same with business. You run a business and everything's relatively okay. You're happy with it, you're earning money, and you're able to pay your wages to your staff, and you're good with your customers. And then a pandemic hits, and that throws everything out the window. You don't know what's going to happen. And then as time goes on, it gets more and more difficult. Or it could be that you have a really nice house and in a really nice area, but you come home one day and you've been robbed. Or you have booked this holiday and it's your retirement holiday, your big holiday after working for so long, and you plan this round the world trip, and then suddenly you find out that the airline, it goes bust and you may not get your money back. So it's things like that. They can be big and small examples, but it's good to connect in that way to see what we didn't see before, the danger in sensual pleasures. Venerable Sariputta in the Mahanidesa talks about different kinds of sensual pleasures, in fact 2 kinds of sensual pleasures. The first is objects of sensual pleasure, which is vatu karma. The second is defilements linked or associated with sensual pleasures, which is kāmānaṁ. And we'll go through each of them. So the first one is, what are sensual objects? They are agreeable forms, sounds, odors, tastes, and tactile objects. Bed sheets, coverings, male and female workers, goats and rams, fowls and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses and mares, fields, land, bullion, gold, villages, towns, cities, realms, countries, treasures, storehouses, and any enticing object. So this list is back in the day of the time of the Buddha. But now what we would include in that is all the material possessions that we like or we find agreeable and enticing. So all the way from toys and music to the larger kind of objects as well, including people. But it's really important to note that it's through our sense faculties, particularly our 5 sense faculties. So that's where we have agreeable forms, so that's all the material things. Sounds, so it includes sounds of nature, people's voices, also music. And then odors is all the things that we smell that we like, including perfumes and colognes and smells of nature and food. Taste, so our food preferences also come into this, and then tactile objects, so whatever is through our sense of touch. So the most important thing is to understand the range that it comes in when it comes to objects of sensual pleasure. And then the second kind of sensual pleasure is defilements, sensual defilements. And in the Mahanidesa, Venerable Sariputta says, sensuality as desire, as lust, as desire and lust, as intention, as lustful intention, sensual desire for sensual pleasures, sensual lust, sensual delight, sensual craving, sensual affection, sensual passion, sensual infatuation, sensual attachment, the floods of sensuality, the bond of sensuality, clinging to sensual pleasures, the hindrance of sensual desire. So all these words, they kind of all mix in together, but there's an escalation in the process that you become more and more bonded and obsessed with sensual things. So really, when you listen to this, it's how the mind gets swept away, that it escalates, and the intensity of it towards sensual pleasures becomes more and more. It gets more and more to the extent of being obsessive, even addicted to sensual things. So when you hear people say they're addicted to shoes, or they say they're addicted to money, or they're having intense longing to be rich, all those different kinds of ways that people describe, it's really where the sensual defilements take hold in the mind, that you're obsessed with it, addicted to it. You're always thinking about it. And that is what covers the mind. When you try and meditate, for example, it's very difficult to concentrate the mind. Or even if you try to study, but the mind is imbued with longing for a particular new gadget, or wanting to indulge in a book, or wanting to indulge in food, that covers up the ability to concentrate. And so that therefore these defilements associated, linked to sensual pleasures, become a huge problem. So Buddha talks about both the sensual objects that we crave to and the defilements that take hold of the mind. This is Venerable Sariputta's way of explaining the Buddha's words. The Buddha gives a wonderful teaching in the Nibbedika Sutta about how we should understand sensual pleasures. And he begins by talking about the 5 objects of sensual pleasures, because essentially every single sensual pleasure comes through the sense doors. So when you look at forms cognizable by the eye, sounds cognizable by the ear, odors cognizable by the nose, tastes cognizable by the tongue, and tactile objects cognizable by the body, these are the things that we wish for, we desire, we find agreeable, pleasing, and these are the things that are connected with sensual pleasure. And so we're tantalized by them. But then the Buddha makes a very, very important point, one that we've touched on, that those objects are not sensual pleasures. They are the objects of sensual pleasure. And then he goes on to have this verse that says, a person's sensual pleasure is lustful intention. They are not sensual pleasures, the pretty things in the world. A person's sensual pleasure is lustful intention. The pretty things remain just as they are in the world, but the wise remove the desire for them. So this is very, very important, because what the Buddha is saying is, if you have an intention towards them, these objects of sensual pleasure, whether they are through the ear, eyes, nose, tongue, or body, that is what is the sensual pleasure, not the actual objects themselves. Now, to understand that, let's use an example. Let's use the example of chocolate cake. So one person really likes chocolate cake. They wish for it, they desire it, they find it really yummy. And so that person does have sensual pleasure for the chocolate cake. Now, another person comes along and they look at the chocolate cake and they're not interested. So that person does not have sensual pleasure towards that chocolate cake. They don't have any intention towards, they don't desire it, they're not interested. So it doesn't incite any kind of craving or longing in them. So it's not a problem for them. But for the person that has that longing for the chocolate cake, the craving for it, the desire for it, and if they keep thinking, I want it now, or I want more, I hope that I can have it next week and the day after that, and so on and so forth, then it becomes a problem. So there are many things in the world that we're not interested in, and there's no danger from those things if we're not interested in them. But it's the things that we're interested in. So when you think about the things in your own life, they could be people in your life that you expect to hug, that you expect to talk to. They could be different foods. They could be your pets. They could be particular music. All kinds of different things that you cognize through the different sense bases. And so if you have intense longing, intense desire, craving to experience pleasure or happiness through those things, that is what sensual pleasures are about. And that's what Buddha says, when they decline through various different means, that's when you encounter problems and you encounter the dart of sorrow, of depression. The Buddha then goes on to talk about what is the source and origin of sensual pleasures. And the Buddha's answer is contact is its source and origin. So what the Buddha means by this is, it's when we come into contact with objects of sensual pleasure, that is when the opportunity for us to have an intention or a longing towards those things, that's when it starts. So if we don't have contact from those things, then it's not a problem. We don't see them, we don't smell them, we don't, all the things through the sense bases. Then the next thing that the Buddha says is, what is the diversity of sensual pleasures? And the Buddha says sensual desire for forms is one thing, sensual desire for sounds is another, sensual desire for odors is still another, sensual desire for taste is still another, sensual desire for tactile objects is still another. So again, that's the diversity. It can be experienced through any of our sense doors, through these different sensual objects. And it's our desire for them which brings the diversity of sensual pleasures. So if you take an example with forms, it could be a person that we have desire towards. In terms of sounds, it's particular music or particular talks. If it's odors, then it's particular smells. Usually we like nice smells, not horrible smells. Same with taste, we have food preferences. And then with tactile objects, things that touch us, we like soft things rather than hard things, and all those sorts of different preferences. And then the next thing is, what is the result of sensual pleasures? So this is an important one. The Buddha says one produces an individual existence that corresponds with whatever sensual pleasures one desires, and which may be the consequence either of merit or demerit. This is the result of sensual pleasures. What's really interesting about this particular statement is the Buddha doesn't even talk about the dart of sorrow or any of those experiences that you experience at the feeling level here. He's actually talking about the big picture. He's saying that if you are bound to sensual pleasures, you don't see the danger, the degradation and the defilement of sensual pleasures, then what it means at the end of your life is that it will produce another existence due to your merit or demerit, so your punya, and at the same time, it's based on what you desire. The easiest way to understand this is, if you desire a particular taste and you haven't let go of that taste, then that means you want to produce another tongue in the future. If you want to produce another tongue in the future, that means you want to produce another body. So you are bound to the sensual realms. If you remember from our talks on the heavenly realms, we talked about the sensual realms. So that includes the lower realms, the human realm, and some of the heavenly realms, those kāmāloka heavenly realms. Buddha is saying that you'll come back again into another birth. Now, then the Buddha goes on to say, and what is the cessation of sensual pleasures? And the Buddha says it's the cessation of contact. So isn't that interesting? If you don't make contact with sensual objects, then that's the cessation. So when we talk about in the metta school meditation, we talk about santindriyo, we talk how that's associated with sense restraint, restraining our sense faculties. That means we don't want to make contact. And so we know from the metta meditation that when you have peaceful sense faculties, it gives you the ability to develop loving kindness. You don't get distracted by sensual objects or even sensual defilements. And then the last thing that the Buddha says is the Noble Eightfold Path is the way leading to the cessation of sensual pleasures, namely right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And we will get to this at the very end of our gradual teaching series to explain this in more detail. But that is the way out of sensual pleasures, and ultimately the way out of all suffering. And so the Buddha says, this is the way to penetrate the spiritual life by understanding all these different aspects to sensual pleasures, all the way from what are objects of sensual pleasure, all the way through to what is the cessation of sensual pleasures. So this is a very wonderful teaching from the Buddha. In the Mahadukkha Khandha Sutta, this is in Majjhima Nikaya, discourse number 13, so the middle-length discourses, the Buddha gives further reasons for the danger in sensual pleasures, and they're quite interesting to go through because it's quite extensive. So the first one is, when you earn a living by means of one's skill, trade or profession, having to face hardship and challenging external conditions that may cause injury, pain or risk of death. So Buddha's linking this to, of course, dukkha, because this sutta is about dukkha. And he's talking about dukkha in our present life, that when you take on a particular job, whatever your skill, trade or profession is, sometimes you encounter danger that can cause injury or risk of death, or some kind of suffering in the process of working. The second one is, if no property accrues after working, striving and making effort, one sorrows, grieves and laments, crying, my work is in vain, my effort is fruitless. So a good example with this is, if you work at a job that is minimum wage and it's not enough to even pay your bills, and you've worked so hard. There are many jobs like this, and you find you're not getting paid enough. Even if you run a business and you find that things are getting more expensive to purchase in order to supply certain goods, the same thing. It's, you think you've worked so hard, but it's in vain because you're not making enough money. And then the third one is, if property accrues after working, striving and making effort, one experiences pain, grief in protecting it from the ruling class, thieves and natural disasters and hateful heirs. And you think, how can I securely protect my property? When a loss is experienced, one sorrows, grieves and laments, what I had, I no longer have. So this is a bit like the story of the Brahmin farmer. He's worked so hard and he's tried to protect his crops from not just natural disaster, he's tried to protect it from insects and from people stealing his crops and all kinds of things. And then, he experienced the flood. So he was devastated. So there are various examples similar to this one, where you've worked really hard and you're protecting it from a criminal coming to take it, or you're protecting it from the government coming to take too much tax, or things of that nature. Or you're protecting it from hateful heirs, means someone in your family who is jealous of you and maybe wants to take it from you. And so when you lose it, you say what this example says, which is, what I had, I no longer have. And so you lament what was to be that didn't last. So the main thing is, with all of these so far, you can see the immense amount of pain and torture around trying to sustain these things, trying to make it work, and then something happening and it devastates you. And then the fourth example is, with sensual pleasures as the cause and source and basis for brawls and disputes with various parties, leading to physical violence that results in death or deadly suffering. So people fight over sensual pleasures. So they can fight over their partners, they can fight over someone trying to take your things from you, they can fight over just simply not being agreeable with each other. So when we talk about various parties, it could be you're fighting with the government, or you're fighting with your partner, or you're fighting with somebody else who's a third party, or you're fighting with your friends, or you're fighting with your brother or sister, or your parents, your children. So we often find that due to sensual pleasures, and it could be material things or it could be something associated with a material thing, but largely you just end up fighting, and so there's a lot of dukkha, a lot of unhappiness that comes of it. The fifth and sixth items that the Buddha talks about are really linked with fighting and battling. So number 5 is, with sensual pleasures as the core source and basis for taking up weapons and charging into battle, where one is wounded and it results in death or deadly suffering. And the sixth is very similar, except the Buddha says it's attacking a fortified stronghold. Again, one is wounded and it results in death or deadly suffering. So in both those cases, what it really is talking about is fighting over something like land or property, or getting into a bit of a stoush over views about sensual pleasures, even about trade wars or some kind of technological war. And so you send in the troops to attack another country or attack another place. And it's really a battle around sensual pleasures. But it's so akusala, it's so unwholesome, because one, there's a lot of killing, a lot of injuring, harming, hurting, and we know there are very unwholesome results of that. And if you participate in that, then it results in your own death or some kind of injury that is the equivalent of death. Then the seventh that the Buddha talks about is, again, with sensual pleasures as the core, source and basis, for breaking into houses, plundering wealth, committing burglary and other misdeeds, when they are caught, being subject to torture and punishment, and it results in death or deadly suffering. So again, this is quite extreme, but it's associated with sensual pleasures because you covet other people's things. You are greedy for them. And so that causes you to break into people's houses, steal from them, and do other naughty things. And when you're caught, then you have to suffer the torture or punishment. So if you get caught by a person who's not very happy with you for doing that, you get beaten, you get attacked and all kinds of stuff. But if you're punished, say you go to prison, well, maybe you're locked up for a very long time. And so that's what the Buddha says about how it can be associated with sensual pleasures. You don't often see that all these things lead to very unwholesome grounds and effects. And then the eighth and final one is, with sensual pleasures as the core, source and basis, people indulge in misconduct of body, speech and mind. Having done so, on dissolution of the body after death, they reappear in states of deprivation, in an unhappy place or destination, in perdition, even in hell. So this is very much the bigger picture of things, that when we deal with sensual pleasures, what we don't see, particularly at the level where it's not going to war and we're not stealing as a burglar or something like that, we don't see, even when we're dealing with sensual pleasures, how much misconduct happens at the level of body, speech and mind because of that longing, wanting, and all the defilements that come with it, and the escalation of those defilements. And so the Buddha's always said, and we know this from our talk on virtue, that one can end up in a very unhappy destination. Because if you break your virtue, your sila, so you're doing dasa akusala, so the unwholesome deeds and actions through body, speech and mind, you can expect an unhappy destination. That's the cause and effect of our volitional actions. So that's something to really see. Now you can really see it from the examples which are more massive, so from wars, from stealing and crime and all that. But for us, we really need to look at it from our everyday existence. We may not go to war, we may not steal in the sense of being a burglar or a robber, but there are other things that we do that are associated with sensual pleasures that we don't see how virtue gets compromised. So in a nutshell, these 8 different things that the Buddha talks about is, when you investigate them, you realize there is great danger in sensual pleasures, that we toil, we work hard, and yet all we meet is dukkha, is suffering. And what we do experience as the gratification or the pleasantness of sensual pleasures, it's very fleeting. And sometimes what it causes us to do is misapprehend the entire thing around sensual pleasures. In the same sutta, the Mahadukkha Kanda Sutta, the Buddha says, "And what bhikkhus is the escape in the case of sensual pleasures? It is the removal of desire and lust, the abandonment of desire and lust for sensual pleasures. This is the escape in the case of sensual pleasures." So if you can understand all the different reasons or things that the Buddha talks about that we just went through, then you can see when you have intense wanting and longing, and you put so much effort towards sensual pleasures, and you see the danger in them, then you realize what you need to remove is all your intentions, all your desire, craving, passion, intoxication, obsessiveness in some cases towards sensual pleasures. At least know them for what they are. And so it's not that you don't eat and work and do all those things, but the amount of bondage, the amount of holding on to that you do with sensual pleasures, at least you start to remove it, and then at some point in time, you're quite detached from it, even if you're going through the process with sensual pleasures. Now, at the moment, it might be difficult to understand, but the important thing is just to start to see. The more you hold on to something, it's very difficult to let go. So what Buddha is trying to explain to us is to see sensual pleasures very clearly. And so these are all the different ways that he's helping us to see. Now, some of what we go through in this session you may not fully understand, but that's okay. Even if you take one thing from this session, that's good enough, because later on it might come to you more. But the main thing is to get the idea from Buddha's words, his examples, and to even try and find your own examples to see whether you can penetrate what the Buddha means by danger, decline, defilement in sensual pleasures. The Buddha often uses similes as a way of teaching us. And when it comes to sensual pleasures, it's no different. He has a series of similes, in fact, many similes. So this one sutta that we're looking at right now is the Dutiya Yoda Ajiva Sutta. This is in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, discourse number 76. And the Buddha in this sutta is talking about warriors and how they get injured, wounded, sometimes pass away from their injuries, or whether they're successful, and the distinction between those particular circumstances. And then he likens it to the monks, how they're in a particular battle in relation to spiritual development and overcoming the whole mass of suffering. So the similes that the Buddha gives for sensual pleasures in this sutta are a chain of bones, a piece of meat, a grass torch, a charcoal pit, a dream, fruits on a tree, the butcher's knife and block, a sword stake, borrowed goods, and a snake's head. So when the Buddha talks about this, he's talking about overcoming sensual pleasures by looking at sensual pleasures as an obstruction, that they're all like these similes. And when you contemplate these similes, it's meant to help you to see the danger, degradation, and defilement of sensual pleasures. So the first one, the chain of bones. So when you have a bone, usually if you give an animal a bone, they're looking for meat on the bone, but there's nothing there. And so there's not much gratification that you get from whatever desire you have towards it. And so that's why the Buddha gives this chain of bones as a simile. When you contemplate it, you think there's not much there. There's no pleasure in that. Then when it comes to the piece of meat, what the Buddha usually talks about when it comes to the piece of meat is that you have to share it. Usually if you have a bit of meat, a little bit of gain in some form from some object of sensual pleasure, you usually have to fight to keep it. Other people want it. And so it's only this little piece of meat. Then when it comes to the grass torch, imagine you're holding a grass torch, it's burning. Even as you try to hold it, the wind blows. And so you get burnt in the process. So that's another way of looking at sensual pleasures. Then the charcoal pit. Usually a person doesn't want to be thrown into the charcoal pit or to fall into the charcoal pit because it scorches you, it burns you. And as we gravitate towards seeking pleasure from sensual things, what we ultimately feel is burning up with pain, either through the decline of those objects of sensual pleasure, or they ultimately they hurt us when they change. And then the fifth simile is the dream. So the dream is always something transient, it's temporary, it's so fleeting, it passes away so quickly. So if you imagine you're having a dream and you're seeing all these wonderful things, but then when you wake up, there's nothing there. So that's what Buddha also asks us to look at when we look at sensual pleasures. Then the sixth one is borrowed goods. So in this case, again, we take things on loan and they're not really ours, they're temporary. We might even use sensual pleasures to big ourselves up. But if we really think about that we've taken loans in order to have these things, then you see through the sensual pleasures as well, that they're not really ours. They can be taken at any time, taken back at any time. The fifth simile is fruits on a tree. So usually with fruits, you see them break off from the tree, they get damaged. You also see fruits decay very quickly. So you need to see that quite clearly. With sensual pleasures, they're often prone to decay. Our houses, we often have to maintain them because they decay. When we buy things, we have to take care of them because they get eaten or they decay, with clothing, with furniture, all sorts of things. So when you contemplate sensual pleasures like a fruit on a tree, it's really looking at the damaging, the breaking away, and then the decline, the decay of such objects. Then when it comes to the eighth simile, that's the butcher's knife on a block, you get this sense always of cutting up, that with sensual stimulation, you always have some kind of impinging thing on your senses. And it becomes afflictive, that at some point it causes harm, you get distressed, always troubled by defilements in order to seek out sensual pleasures. And then the ninth one is the sword stake. So with the sword stake, you often associate the sword with piercing, with something that's wounding, afflictive, causing harm, inflicting pain, causing hurt, discomfort. So that's another way of looking at sensual pleasures. We don't often see it that way, but with these similes, the Buddha is asking us to correct how we look at sensual pleasures. And then the snake's head. This is considered to be dangerous. Like when you think about being bitten by a snake, then you know that there's danger there and you try and avoid it. So that's the other way of looking at sensual pleasures, that there's danger there and so we want to avoid them. So this is a way of looking at sensual pleasures. They provide very little gratification. So in the suttas, for example, the simile of the snake, the Buddha says, sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering and despair, and the danger in them is still more. And so that's what we can't see. That's what we need to investigate, to really see for ourselves, to even take these similes into our mind and think, is that really true? And so it's like the Buddha is someone who has seen for himself all of these things, and he's seen the repercussions of indulging and remaining holding to sensual pleasures. And so when he sees that, he's coming to warn us, don't do this, because he knows the ultimate predicament is we'll be bound to samsara, to more of the same through birth and death, more of the same. And sensual pleasures he often calls the lower of any kind of pleasure that you can get, any kind of happiness that you can get. It's not the same as what we saw in the heavenly realms. When you get to the form heavenly realms, the rupa loka and the arupa loka, all those form and formless realms, those heavenly realms, they experience pleasure that is far superior without any of these sensual things. And we don't know that because we're only aware of what it's like in the human realm. But the Buddha is saying to us, just like we saw when we looked through each of the descriptions of the different realms, their pleasure is quite immense, their peace is quite vast, and it's much greater than in the human realm, and definitely much more than in the lower realms. When we look at sensual pleasures and we look at how we get intoxicated by them, how we are driven by them, then you realize that we get very excited out of lust, out of greed, a very intense longing and wanting, desire. And it causes a number of things. It causes us not to take care with ourselves and with others. It causes us to engage in misconduct by body, speech, and mind. We don't see how it really is according to what the Buddha teaches at the point that we are driven by those sensual pleasures. And the greatest thing that I like from the Channa Sutta, this is Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 3, discourse number 71, is the Buddha says, when you're driven by this lust or greed, this intense desire, it leads to blindness, loss of vision, and lack of knowledge. It is obstructive to wisdom, aligned with distress, and does not lead to nibbana. So this is not literal blindness or loss of vision. It's really that it errs on the side of delusion. Everything that is wise and pure and that will help you to see our predicament, it gets covered up. And if you're looking to enter the stream, to really mitigate all this suffering, then it gets all covered up, it gets blocked. And so it's really important to see the link between sensual pleasures and the root of greed or lust. It's really important to know where sensual pleasures fit in when it comes to this path that the Buddha is setting out for us. So when you go to the Anusota Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 4, discourse number 5, the Buddha says, "And what is the person who goes along with the stream? Here, someone indulges in sensual pleasures and performs bad deeds. This is a person who goes along with the stream." So when you think about worldly people who don't know or understand the Buddha's teachings, these are people who are going along with the stream. They have no idea about the danger in sensual pleasures, so they indulge in them, grasp them, remain holding. They get very obsessed about sensual pleasures. And then they don't have a care about doing akusala, the unwholesome deeds through body, speech, and mind. So this is what the Buddha calls going along with the stream. In contrast to that, the Buddha says, "And what is the person who goes against the stream? Here, someone does not indulge in sensual pleasures or perform bad deeds. Even with pain and dejection, weeping with a tearful face, he lives the complete and purified spiritual life. This is called the person who goes against the stream." So this is not an easy thing to do, to go against the stream. We've been conditioned from childhood to enjoy things through our senses. So after learning this teaching from the Buddha, it is seriously quite hard to do so. But when you really see and you penetrate, even connect with one aspect of this when it comes to sensual pleasures, and you see how much suffering, how much we misapprehend sensual pleasures, how much danger there is in it, how much defilement is in it, then you know that there is something in what the Buddha is teaching. And so you can't automatically switch to go against the stream, but what you can do is to start understanding it, and then it naturally starts to happen. And it's a gradual process. It's not something that automatically you just turn away from sensual pleasures. But what is really helpful is to understand all these things that the Buddha is teaching us, because then it does get a little simpler. What you can see when we go through all these things about the danger, degradation, and defilement in sensual pleasures is that virtue plays a very important part in protecting us. So if you wonder about how can you overcome sensual pleasures, one of the things that is very helpful is to look after one's virtue. So we've spoken about this in the talk on virtue. So this could be the 5 precepts, it could be more. It could be also paying attention to the 10 wholesome deeds through body, speech, and mind. But very much so is to see the importance of virtue in protecting against sensual pleasures, because it's a very firm foundation not to get swept up with greed, not to get swept up with the defilements of covetousness and things of that nature. The Buddha's path, as we know, is very much about non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. And so when you see sensual pleasures clearly, or begin to see sensual pleasures clearly, then you know that virtue plays a very, very important role in protecting us. What is also very helpful is guarding the doors to our sense faculties. So we like to think about this as a security guard. So you put a security guard at the eyes, the nose, the tongue, the ear, the body, and the mind. So if you remember from the metta school meditation, in order to be able to cultivate, develop loving kindness, you need to have peaceful sense faculties. They can't be overwhelmed with desire and longing and wanting and going out into the world, because what happens is it destroys one's wisdom and compromises one's ability to generate metta. So the same thing when it comes to sensual pleasures. What we saw at the beginning at the Nibbedika Sutta is it is contact which triggers the whole thing when it comes to sensual pleasures. If we see something, smell something, taste something, hear something, we get triggered. So what's important here is if you put a security guard, you see the merit of putting a security guard in place, then it's very helpful. And the other way of thinking of it, when you remember the Metta School meditations, we talked about the tortoise, the simile of the tortoise, and how when it perceives danger, it retracts its head and its limbs. That is also a similar thing. So if you can see it in that way, it can be very helpful. And then you don't get tempted, enticed, driven out through the sense doors into sensual pleasures, and then meet with all kinds of difficulty. We can end this session by touching on the link to our previous module, which was looking at heavenly realms. And we look at this in terms of rebirth, because the Buddha says in the Karma Yoga Sutta, one bound by the bond of sensual desire and by the bond of existence is a returner, one who comes back to this state. One freed from the bond of sensual desire, but still bound by the bond of existence, is a non-returner, one who does not come back to this state. One freed from the bond of sensual desire and freed from the bond of existence is an arahant, one in whom the taints are destroyed. So you recognize this diagram from our sessions, our previous module, looking at the heavenly realms. And so we spoke about the realms of sensuality, which go from the hells all the way up to the paranimitta vasavati deva realm. And the human realm is in the middle of that. So when you haven't given up sensual pleasures, then you're bound to the karma loka, these realms of sensuality. And so that means you keep coming back to birth and death, birth and death. This is actually a very big danger when it comes to sensual pleasures, and most at risk of being reborn into the lower realms, particularly if you don't have generosity, giving, and also virtue, and you don't understand Kamma and Rebirth. Now, if you give up sensual pleasures, then as we saw from our talks on the heavenly realms, you can be reborn in the realms of form, Rupa Loka, and you experience a much greater pleasure than the pleasure of the sensual pleasures. But again, you can still be bound back into the world. Now, as the Buddha says, if you give up the sensual pleasures and you don't have the bond of existence, that means also you don't wish to come back anymore. You see the truth. Then you are reborn as a non-returner, the highest of all the realms in terms of living beings. And one is in either the aviha, the atapa, sudasa, sudasi, or the akanita, as we've seen. We've spoken about this. And then when you are freed from all of it, the sensual desire, the bond of existence, and you've uprooted all the taints, all the defilements, all the fetters, then you are an arahant. And so you are safe. You get to experience the supreme happiness, which is lasting. So this is a very important thing, that the greatest danger of sensual pleasures is actually being bound to samsara and not knowing that you keep coming back to the whole mass of suffering. Sensual pleasures is the most dangerous, is because you haven't given up the sense faculties, the experiences through the sense faculties. So your intention at the point of death is always to create another ear, eye, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And so when that happens, you create another body, and it can be in any of these karma loka worlds, any of these sensual worlds. And so that is the biggest danger. And so when you see that, you understand it, then you take more caution and you train towards being free of the desire for any sensual thing. And that is part of the training that the Buddha talks about. In what we've been through most of this session, we've talked about really suppressing sensual pleasures. So when we look through the similes, we look at the different reasoning that the Buddha gives. This is really around suppressing sensual pleasures by seeing them clearly. When you see them clearly, that's one way of avoiding sensual pleasures. The other way is by eradicating. So I'll just read out what is in the Mahanidesa, what is said about karma. So Venerable Sariputta says, how does one avoid sensual pleasures by eradication? Developing the path of stream entry. One avoids them by eradicating sensual pleasures that lead to the realm of misery. Then Venerable Sariputta goes on and says, developing the path of once returner. One avoids them by eradicating coarse sensual pleasures. Then he says, developing the path of non-returner. One avoids them by eradicating residual sensual pleasures. And then finally, developing the path of arahantship. One avoids them by eradicating them entirely and in all respects without any remainder. Thus one avoids sensual pleasures by eradication. So this is the key, why it's so important to develop path and fruit in this Buddha's teaching. It's because it saves you, it protects you, it guards you. So the aspiration towards path and fruit is a very wholesome one. And so this is the final part to understanding sensual pleasures. We've now come to the end of our session, our main session on the danger, degradation and defilement in sensual pleasures. As you can see, it's a very vast area and one that is very important. And so a gentle reminder that it's okay if you've only understood or if you've only seen one aspect of the Buddha's teaching. This is a gradual process. But what's really good is that we go together trying to learn, trying to chip away at what we're hearing from the Buddha. And to know that the Buddha is trying to help us to find safety, security at the end of this life and while we are living this life. So some of the additional or bonus sessions that we'll have, which will be helpful to deepen our understanding of this area, we'll be looking at some of the sayings of the Buddha and the related stories. This is from the Dhammapada. We'll also look at sensual pleasures as debt. There's a sutta called the Ina Sutta, which is very useful. And we'll have another session, possibly on the mechanics of sensual pleasures and the greed path. And another one will be a simplified insight pathway meditation on sensual pleasures. When we went through the session, we looked at certain similes. And there's a sutta called the Potaliya Sutta that if you meditate on those similes, it helps you to understand sensual pleasures and the dangers of them a lot better, helps us to penetrate them. So we'll look at that as well. And hopefully we'll do a guided meditation to just help you along. We can end our session here. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem, wishing you well. Terowan Saranai.